Thank you very much. I promise to be brief. So, so here's my presentation outline. And as a way of introduction, what do we know? We know that temperature trends and projections for tropical Africa suggest a warmer climate under under urban other climate change. I'm sorry, and that there has been an increased health concern for urban populations. And we also know that despite the acclimatization to hot weather conditions in this part of the world, there are evidences that increasing urban temperatures has significant effect on human health, which include increase in physiological stress and some heat-related self-reported effects. And globally, we see an increase in literature emphasizing a link between extreme temperature and increase in cardiovascular mortality and emergencies. But despite the continuous increase in cardiovascular diseases in Nigeria, in the incidence and even in the prevalence, as well as increase in thermal stress and the high prevalence of risk factors in urban environments, this relationship has not been examined. So there is an existing gap in knowledge. We want to know if temperature is a core factor for the observed increase in cardiovascular diseases in Nigeria, and if there is risk associated with the continuous exposure to higher urban temperatures under a warmer climate. The primary aim of the study is to examine the relationship between apparent temperature and emergency hospital admissions for cardiovascular diseases in seven urban areas in Nigeria for the period 2010 to 2019, that is 10 years. The specific objective are to examine the relationship between daily apparent temperature and daily counts of emergency cardiovascular admissions, as well as to look at the risk associated with the lag effect of apparent temperature, of exposure to extreme apparent temperature on admissions for cardiovascular diseases in those selected location. What we really want to know here is if there is an association between the observed increase in cardiovascular diseases and thermal stress due to increasing urban temperature. And if this increase in urban temperature is a contributing factor for the continuous incidence and prevalence of cardiovascular diseases in Nigeria. And we also want to know if there is an increased risk of cardiovascular disease emergencies with continuous exposure to increasing urban temperature as projected by the IPCC. The concepts adopted for this study include the urban climate, which talks about the differences between temperature in the urban environment and the surrounding rural environment. And then I used the concept of human bioclimate and thermal comfort. And this talks about the personal experience of heat in terms of personal perception of how you perceive the immediate ambient temperature, as well as human circadian rhythm, which helps us understand how disruptions in the circadian rhythm of the circulatory system can contribute to the development of cardiovascular diseases. To achieve this, the study area, generally we have these climatic zones, and for this particular study, it cannot be used because the climatic zones that we know by Köppen's classification was made for agricultural purposes. So we have to look at bioclimatic zones that incorporate temperature, relative humidity, and other aspects of other variables that can give an idea of how comfortable an environment is to to live. So based on this different bioclimatic zones, I selected major urban areas with population over millions across the different climatic zones. And the urban environments they have well established um, they have well established medical teaching universities that have been in the practice of cardiovascular emergency care prior to the study period. Now, because of the land mass of Nigeria, the experiences of individuals living in those different climatic zones vary in terms of the amount of the temperature and relative humidity. In the southern part of the country, we have relative humidity as high as over 70% almost throughout the year, while in the northernmost part of the country, temperature is high, but relative humidity is very low. Probably that is why they've been able to cope with higher temperature in that part of the country. Now we know that over 50% of Nigerians reside in urban areas, and this population is expected to increase by 2030, which means that more people in the urban environment will be exposed to heat-related health problems. And so, to look at the relationship between apparent temperature and cardiovascular diseases, I used minimum temperature, minimum and maximum temperature, daily temperature, as well as relative humidity to calculate apparent temperature, which is an heat index of human thermal comfort. And the data is easily accessible, so it makes it one of the one of the index that is commonly used for assessing human thermal comfort. Then the daily emergency records were extracted from the accident and emergency units of each of the um, of the university teaching hospitals in each of the study location, and the interest was in accident because according to previous studies, the case exposure to extreme temperatures have we, we're able is being captured by emergency cases that which is acute. So to understand the trend, the underlying characteristic of apparent temperature in the study locations for the study period, I used the time series analysis to show the underlying characteristic. And as you can see, Sokoto and Lagos are the hottest urban environment in Nigeria, despite the fact that they are both at two extreme end of the country. Now the result. Oh, I'm sorry. The relationship between apparent temperature and cardiovascular diseases was examined using a quasi Poisson regression model that was combined with a distributed lag nonlinear model. And based on that, I also used a natural cubic spline to capture the extreme ends of apparent temperature because I wanted to see the whole range of the temperature and how it affects daily emergency cases. So in these locations, Lagos, Ibadan, Abuja, Kano, and Shekoto, we saw a U-shaped kind of relationship, and which indicates that both extremely low temperature and high temperature are associated with increase in cardiovascular emergency admissions. However, the steepness of the slope of the exposure response surface relationship indicates that above the minimum risk temperature shows that there were more cases associated with higher apparent temperature in Lagos, Ibadan, Abuja, and Sokoto, but that was not the case in Kano. So also for the lag effect, okay, I can always come back to that on the next slide. For Kano, even though it was a U-shaped relationship, we had the association was more with lower temperature than with higher temperature. Yeah. So for Jos, I call it a J shape because the relationship was one-sided. It was associated with a very low apparent temperature, which is understandable because that is the coolest urban environment in Nigeria. But Maiduguri looks somewhat like linear, but it's not. But the relationship is more with lower apparent temperature than with higher apparent temperature. And I looked at the risk at some extreme temperature. So at the fifth percentile threshold of daily apparent temperature, as well as at the 95th percentile threshold of apparent temperature. For extremely low temperatures, the relationship was more with was significant in Jos, Madiguri, and Shokoto. But for the heat effect was more with Lagos, Ibadan, Abuja, and Kano. I also looked at the lag effect. Um, for lower apparent temperature, the effect of lower apparent temperature on cardiovascular emergencies was very low at lag 0 to 5 and even to about 2 weeks after exposure before we started seeing major effects in cold effects, which means that there is a delayed effect and that the effect of cold temperature is seen at longer lags than at shorter lags in Lagos, Ibadan, Abuja. But for Kano, the situation was different. We had the lower apparent temperature was the cold effect was seen at lag 0 to 5, which is quite different from the other U-shaped relationship that we saw in for Madiguri. There was more relationship with lower apparent temperature, and it was almost like the same all through the lag. But for Shokoto, the relationship between at lag 0, it wasn't so much, but the effect was seen as lag increased. Then for the higher apparent temperature, we can see that almost at 0 to 5 days after exposure, the the heat effect was very high. Similarly, in Ibadan, Abuja, as well as in Sokoto. But for Kano, the heat effect was not immediately seen, although it appeared, but was relatively low the um, compared to the cold effect that we saw at short lag. And for Madiguri, temperature, apparent temperature was relatively low compared to what we experienced in the lower apparent temperature. So, from the findings of the study, we saw that exposure to increasing urban temperature is a contributing risk factor for the increased incidence of cardiovascular disease in Nigeria, and that both exposure to extremely high and low apparent temperature contributed to it. Although this effect varies with season, because that is why we see the differences between the cold effect and the heat effect. During the Hamatan, when temperatures are very low, um, there are more cases with apparent temperature and cardiovascular emergencies in the northern part of the country, in the northern location. This is understandable because relative humidity is really is drier in that part of the of the country, but the temperature is usually lower during Hamatan compared to the southern part of the country. So, but for warmer dry season, the effects can be very high, especially in the southwestern part of the country where we have high relative humidity, and then when we have high temperature during the dry season, or just the transitional months between the rainy season and the dry season, there's tendency for the hot conditions to be unbearable. And unlike the most part of the world where there are heating systems to cope with extremely low temperature, this is lacking in the northern parts of the country, and this might be why lower apparent temperature is has more effect than the heat effect in the northern part of the country. There are limitations to this study, which includes missing medical files that were difficult to obtain, as well as a lot of institutional strikes that delayed the work. But this is one of the objectives of my PhD thesis, and I'm happy to share with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for the presentation, Betty. So we won't have time for questions right now, but we can get back after our last speaker is done.